I am hosting today's at home, the 5th in our series, and I'm delighted to be doing so and to have you all here to hear some really fascinating papers. There are 3 in total, and we will be running paper and then questions and then paper and then questions. The speakers will be speaking in the same order that they are on the Eventbrite site. So just to remind you, first up will be Emily Gallagher, who will be telling us about the artistic depiction and preservation of Victorian working class dress. She'll be followed by Emily Taylor, who will be discussing collecting of men, materials and myths, not collecting men, as Robin thought and was quite excited to see as a title. And then our final speaker will be Kimberly Lamb, who will be presenting her paper Behind the Scenes, Elizabeth Keckley's Written Garments and the Fabrication of Black Interiority. As you'll be aware, the event will be recorded and we'll be sharing it on our YouTube channel, but only those attending today will get to hear Emily Taylor's paper. So that's your reward for giving up part of your Sunday, bonus feature. We're going to try and keep things to around an hour or just over. So I'm going to stop talking now and we'll get straight on with our first speaker, who, as I mentioned, is Emily Gallagher, and I'll just introduce you to her. So Emily recently completed an MA in Fashion Curation at London College of Fashion. Her thesis examined Victorian and Edwardian working class dress in museums across England. Her academic research centres around museology, material culture, Victorian dress and culture, and she's currently researching the ways in which Victorian women's dress histories are imagined and represented within dress history literature and museums. Alongside her research, she's also advised on Victorian dress history for a photograph colorisation company. We all know that colorisation gets people excited. And she often writes blog posts on dress history. And I was going to say, Emily, if you want to share any links to your blogs in the chat later, please do. I'm sure there'll be some enthusiastic readers amongst the group. But today, Emily will be talking to us about, as I said, the artistic depiction and preservation of Victorian working class dress. So I'll hand over to you now, Emily.
Thank you. Just share my screen. Okay. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you for having me to speak this afternoon. I'm going to share some research that that made up a small chapter of my MA thesis. And since finishing my MA, I've revisited and kind of advanced these thoughts, which is what I wanted to share with this community today. So the chapter began with a pair of 19th century workers' clogs, which were donated to the V&A in 1913 as part of the dress collection of artist Albert Hughes. I first uncovered the clogs last year during the initial stages of my MA research, which aimed to locate and identify surviving Victorian and Edwardian working class dress in museums in England. To do so, I conducted a survey of museums across the country and as a result identified over 700 dress objects, of which clogs constituted the largest percentage. According to my research, the clogs donated to the V&A in 1913 were the earliest and most perplexing acquisition of a working class dress object to a museum in England. At the time of the donation, the V&A, like other museums across the country, were not actively collecting European dress, and the lives and the experiences of the working classes were far removed from their collecting practices. Thus, while it's likely that the V&A perhaps accepted the donation of the Hughes dress collection due to its artistic provenance, the clogs are unlike the rest of the collection and their inclusion is unusual. Hughes, like many Victorian artists, collected examples of historic dress for costumes for his sitters. Like his contemporaries, he favoured feminine beauty, picturesque and historic narratives, which, unlike their rural counterparts, the industrial working class were devoid of, and because they were believed to be contaminated by urbanisation. Nevertheless, the inclusion of a pair of clogs in his collection suggests that Victorian artists did perhaps have an artistic interest in this new social strata, and that those who did are to thank for the survival and earliest textual records of their dress. Infamous for his eclectic hoard of bric-a-brac, we might speculate Rossetti's role in this. Following his death in 1882, the contents of his home was auctioned, the catalogue for which listed a myriad of jewellery from the Middle East, Russia and Asia. It was these accessories which he dressed his working class muses, intending them to be, as Julie Cordell suggests, socially illegible. Though there's one picture within which dress seems to aid the representation of a modern subject matter. Found, seen here on the right, was unlike Rossetti's other works, as it was his only attempt to paint a modern day scene. The painting depicting a prostitute hiding from a surprise encounter with a past lover is thought to have been begun in 54 and remains unfinished. Interestingly, this has been attributed to Rossetti's inability to find suitable dress to clothe his working class model, Fanny Thornforth. So, although it's been argued that the dress in Rossetti's works were intended to be socially meaningless, Found might be an exception. Here, the subject wears a floral printed dress, perhaps of cotton, which during the period in which Rossetti conceived and worked on Found, was said to have been chiefly worn by working class women. If this is so, we might speculate that the choice of printed dress here was intended to be socially legible, perhaps specifically associated with fallen women. And additionally, we might speculate that as Rossetti preferred painting from life, and we do know that he collected clothing, that at some point a printed dress, i.e. a garment of working class association, might have been in his possession. Meanwhile, Rossetti's desire for the perfect shawl is evident in his correspondence with his assistant Henry Dunn, who he sent second-hand shawls. Like cotton printed dresses, second-hand clothing was synonymous with the working classes. But while speculating Rossetti's intention to depict a working class woman in legible dress, it's important to acknowledge that, true to the founding manifesto of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, he commonly edited the material he depicted in favour of romantic representations. Thus, his depiction of a modern working class woman and her dress might not be completely accurate. However, while Rossetti and the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood edited their working class models, there were artists who favoured realism in their depictions. One of these was Preston-based Patty Mayer. Painting throughout the first decade of the 20th century, she often chose local working women and their dress as the focal point of her work. These women in their regional dress were distinguishable well into the 20th century for the way in which the shawls were draped over their head and for having clogs like the ones in the Hughes collection on their feet. During the period in which Mayer's painting was painting, almost 1 million women were employed in England's textile industry, the majority of whom likely owned and wore a shawl. Thus, the wearing of these shawls was abundant and commonplace, meaning the artistic and curatorial interest in them must have seemed strange. Collecting for Platt Hall, curator Anne Buck was once told to bugger off after approaching a beshawled woman with an interest in her dress. Though Buck did succeed in her quest to acquire mill workers' shawls for Platt Hall, and like Mayer documented and preserved a garment that was once ordinary, though is now a rarity. According to my survey, 74 shawls exist in museums across England, though only one is on display. The brown shawl on the screen here is currently on display in the Science and Industry Museum in Manchester. Like many across the country, it symbolises an extinct occupation. But what's missed in these narratives and is so captivating about Mayer's paintings is the dress gesture caused by the ways in which the shawls were draped. Interestingly, Anne Buck's 1974 study of the shawls she'd collected for Platt Hall revealed that, unlike fashionable shawls, which were folded on the diagonal, those worn by mill workers had been folded down the length. So, divorcing the working classes and their dress experiences from occupational narratives is something that I'm passionate about and I love to see in textual sources such as Mayer's. Her later depiction of a sewing maid reminds us of the relationship and experiences that servants had with cloth and dress. For maids in particular, much of their time was taken up repairing fashionable garments from their mistresses' wardrobes. and then on their days off, they made or customised their own clothes. The latter sartorial experience was one that many working class women shared. On the right is a depiction of Lancashire factory girls at a clothes market by painter Frederick Shields, who was a close friend of Rossetti's and whose wife Rossetti wrote to in search of a shawl for found. While others are trying on shoes in the background, the focal point of this picture is a girl holding up a dress to her frame. Her own clothes are those typical of a northern mill worker. We can see her clogs and a brat, which was a long line style of apron. And her personal dress possessions and aspirations are illustrated, which, unlike common accounts presented to us today in museums and in dress history, her sartorial experience is divorced from her occupation. There are opportunities to do this with surviving material culture. In museums across England, there survives every day and sometimes fashionable dress objects worn by working class women. Here on the left is a day dress of the 1880s that was worn by a housekeeper, and the other is a wedding dress which the curators at York tell me has been heavily repaired and altered. The former is uncannily like the dress in Shields' painting and could perhaps suggest an opportunity for Manchester Art Gallery, where both are housed, to explore this likeness and perhaps present alternative histories of working class dress. So the paintings and objects that I've shared today are a few of many that could be discussed in relation to my research. By uncovering surviving objects and their histories, my research has aided me to contextualise the works I've discussed today, works that I suggest should inspire alternative explorations of working class dress history. And although few admittedly should be used with hesitation, they all offer opportunities to explore the dress of the Victorian working class, and more specifically, their contemporary interpretation, artistic value, and preservation. What initiated my exploration of this and my ongoing research was the workers' clogs in the Hughes collection. Discovering the clogs raised questions about Victorian artists and their relationship with and comprehension of the dress they collected and clothed their working class subjects in. I like to think that perhaps Rossetti and Shields did own contemporary working class dress and that they're yet to be found. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really interesting, Emily. Everyone, we'd love to see some questions in the chat. I did one of those awful, more of a question and a comment additions to the chat. What I didn't say at the start, because I was so excited about introducing our speaker, is that we have a question master working today, which is Robin Calvert, and she's eagerly awaiting your questions. So I don't know if anyone has any questions to kick us off. Robin, how are we doing?
Yeah. So we've just had, well, you've made a comment, but I'll skip that.
Sorry.
But
it's the classic awful thing.
Interestingly, it relates to thinking something I was thinking, but we'll come back to that because I don't like to do the speaker's prerogative thing. I think our guests have prerogative. So Hillary is asked, wondering, Emily, if you've looked at the Talbot Hughes and Seymour Lucas collections in the Museum of London.
Yeah, so I looked at the Talbot Hughes collection. I actually used the Old English Costumes book and because I searched through the pictures to see if there was if the clogs were included in there. They're not in the pictures, but the author Philip Gibbs does mention a pair of clogs in the collection. And I don't know if this, because he refers to them as 17th century. But I don't know of any other clogs in that collection. So I stated in my thesis that I do perhaps think that he's referring to these pair of clogs, but just didn't know the date. The Seymour Lucas collection, to my knowledge, and I've been in contact with the Museum of London and Lucy from the Museum of London, I don't think there was any working class dress in that collection from the era I was looking.
So Matilda's wondering if you found any garments that had been demonstrably altered, like women's wear.
Probably that wedding dress is an example. Obviously, because of COVID, I haven't seen the garments in person. My research was all from home, unfortunately. but they tell me from York Museum that that's been heavily altered, and it doesn't look, I guess they can guess the class from comparing it to others in the other wedding dresses in the collection. It's much more altered and it looks like it's been homemade compared to the others. Off the top of my head, that's the only one that I can remember that was really heavily altered, yeah.
Stephanie's really enjoyed seeing the old clothes fair. So did I. I'm not as familiar with that painting. That's pretty spectacular. Do you have any such wonderful depictions of sunbonnets or farm bonnets being worn?
No, I didn't mention this in my presentation, but my research was just focused on the urban working class. So it was those who lived in the industrial centres and worked in the mills and in the new cities. So I didn't actually look at like rural workers, but I know that there has been a lot more work done on their dress. So I haven't come across that, no.
I wondered actually if you were looking, I mean, not photography just of people more generally, but I immediately was thinking of Helen Adamson and the New Haven Fishwives. And I didn't know if you looked at photograph, because that's just, did you look at that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I was actually looking at photographs when I was preparing this presentation. I was wondering whether to include them, because I do class them as artistic depictions, especially in the works of like Arthur Munby and things like that. I've lost my train of thought. What was the question?
Well, I was wondering if you were looking at New Haven Fishwives.
Yeah, well, the Fishwives is quite interesting. Yeah, the Fishwives is quite interesting because in Newcastle, in the museum there, that they do have a fishwives ensemble. During my research, I uncovered that it's actually a costume, like a fancy dress costume. Oh. But previously, it's been classified and listed in the collection as authentic. So that was something new that my research had uncovered. So yeah, fishwives were present in my research a lot because I was looking into that and trying to figure that out.
That's brilliant. Well, congratulations. It's always good when we feel like we've done something that's helpful. And Gemma has pointed out that there's some clogs in Wales, if you want to get in touch with her, if you've looked at other museums for working class dress. Laura was wondering if you could explain again the way to fold and wear shawls.
Oh, I don't know this like specifically, like I said, because I haven't seen the objects in person. But yeah, so the fashionable shawls were worn on the diagonal. So that must, if the fabric was square, it must have been along the diagonal. But the mill workers just halved them on the line, if you like. I'm not very good with the grain and things like that, but maybe someone else could explain that. But they put them over their heads and shoulders, and they were so recognizable, and I absolutely love this silhouette. When I see these paintings, the ones that I showed today, I think they're just so compelling. And yeah,
well, thank you. There's some really good comments coming at you too in chat, which you'll be able to see later on as well. And when Veronica was saying about that relationship with working class, I think that's something I've been rethinking a bit as well about, writing about artistic dress. I just sort of write about it, but rethinking about how this stuff is kind of problematically romanticized actually through these representations, and how that kind of comes out now as well. And sort of movements that are romanticizing these sort of rural engagement. And, I think it's really, really interesting what your work is pulling out. So, yeah.
So just one point on people wearing shawls as mill workers and how that works. It's a bit of a random aside, but is relevant. Caroline Radcliffe at the University of Birmingham is actually a theatre specialist, but also a maker and a reenactor and a clog dancer, and has dressed up as a mill worker in, not just fancy, a version of fancy dress, but research fancy dress. So Caroline Radcliffe at the University of Birmingham is probably your person to contact about the experience of wearing clogs and wearing shawls within a contemporary context. If you happened to need to do that, anyone visiting, or you, Emily, if you wanted to go that way with your research. But I think if that was done under COVID, and you managed to gather that level of, museum collection representation and that range of artworks, that's an incredibly impressive undertaking under current circumstances, and it was a really fascinating paper. Are there any more questions, Robin, or should we? Okay, so if any further questions occur to you, the audience, as the papers progress, we may have some time at the end to revisit those, and I'm sure Emily would be happy to sort of respond to you in the chat as well whilst we're going on. Brilliant, thank you, Emily. That was really interesting, and raises a lot of questions about our sort of preconceptions that we carry with us, what is collected in museums. Gosh, there's so much interconnected narratives going on. Robin is again going to be leading questions, and I'll give everyone sort of a moment or so to think about and add questions to the chat. While we're waiting, I did put a question in which we can turn to Robin, but is anyone, any other questions that have come through?
No, go ahead. I was going to read your question for you.
Oh, well, I'll let you read it out because I've said enough.
No, you can read it. You're
okay,
here.
well, I mean, it's very long, which is typical for me. And it's mainly because your paper made me think about sort of the way I research, the way I think, the way I teach, and also the way I've collected in museums. And what I was asking really is whether there was sort of a moment, like an object, or something you read, or something you saw that sort of prompted you on this course of research, or whether it's something that sort of trickled into your consciousness. Because until you said this, I feel I shouldn't admit this to such a big field, but I feel like this is a safe space. I hadn't even considered that this is what we might be doing in terms of displaying collecting practices, like perpetuating these narratives. So I wondered if there was like a trigger moment that made you think
not specifically from anything as publication. There was a trigger moment, but it was kind of, it was me hunting around. So basically I've been recently trying to find objects which are working class or working men's fashion in the National Museum's collection. And in order to do that, it requires a lot of digging around and looking at where those objects were coming from. And also just because I come from I am quite interested in gender histories, and other research has made me think about this kind of men in contrast to women and what's going on there. So it was a bit of a combined point of two research streams. And then, yeah, just sort of trying to get to grips with collections data, I ended up sort of mapping it out, and then I realized that we don't have a lot of data to unpick, but we can just about do it in terms of male and female collectors. And yeah, and I think also, having listened to Emily's paper previously, what's going on in a lot of UK institutions and major institutions here is it seems like there's a lot of artists submitting their collections to museums. So it's actually, I think we've maybe got a smaller pool than we think from the 19th century. There's quite a specific person who is contributing to collections. So what we have as a 19th century legacy and what we've built on is maybe a bit more specific than we've given it credit for, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Absolutely. Right. I'll hand over to Robin, but yeah, because otherwise it's just gonna be a chat, and that's not what it's going to be.
Yeah, please do add questions to the chat. So because I think it's a lot of food for thought, and so I'll chime in because I was really intrigued, of course, by that Flugel's narrative of beautiful and useful. Yeah, that jumps out and screams at you. And I'll my dirty confession, which I'll add, is I've not really read Flugel, but that, because as you said, that's sort of one of those people that's like, oh, we're going to do more better things than that now, so yeah, set it aside. But I think it is really important to go back and look at these things and pick them apart. So I'm curious, since you have clearly read him, like, he uses that language, and then I'm immediately like, yeah, but I mean, what he's kind of complaining about, the lack of color, that's what Godwin was writing about. That's what Morris turns to. Like, loads of them are writing about this, but they're doing it in a much less sexist way, actually. I mean, for their time, actually, it's very much like men and women can do this. There's no like resentfulness in what Godwin says. He's like, we can do it too, men. We should have, we used to. Why are we not still? So are there other places where he picks this up, or do you feel like he's twisted that narrative a bit, or he's not quite getting it, or?
I I haven't read, I've read the bits immediately either side of this more recently. It's been a while since I like looked at the whole thing.
Sorry to put you
but
on the spot on that.
No, but the kind of immediate, so the context to him talking about the great masculine renunciation, the preceding kind of section of his book is really focused on women, and in a way there's a whole area where he's basically saying that women are completely sexualized whether they think it or not, and when women say that they're not being sexual, they still are. I'm just like, what is going on here? You sound like a really unpleasant human. But I think it's just, I think it's a way of seeing women at that point in time. And the other context is that Flugel worked in a lab in a university in London. So kind of what I was really trying to pull out of that is that looking at his narratives, and a lot of people still quote the great masculine renunciation, he's kind of received these ideas from the 19th century, but they're really heavily inflected with his personal experience. Yeah. And I think we all bring our personal experience about dress to our studies, and it's not that that's a bad thing, it's that we need to be kind of self-conscious about it now in a way that people weren't in the 20th century, I think. Yeah.
It's also a very white perspective, isn't it? Too, there's that problem, which maybe is problematic because that may not be represented, or it's rather white that's represented in museums, at least here. So that's another I managed to pick apart. Mackenzie has asked, what do you perceive as men's understanding of visual self today?
That's really tricky. So I think today we have so much change and shift going on, and this is because, you know, we're obviously post kind of queer histories becoming really commonplace. So there's so much more narrative identity, but what I'm kind of quite interested in is that actually these core ideas of the strong, manly sportsman and the chivalric gentleman, particularly, we still sit by them, specifically in the UK. I can't really talk about other places that I haven't lived in, but in the UK, those are still threads that come through. And I think what we in cultural institutions need to start thinking about is how our collections don't reflect the new narratives that have happened post kind of 1970s. And I think there's a lot of change today where people are trying to bring in stories about kind of Black histories and LGBTQ, but that isn't being done by really comprehensive collecting in the way that we were collecting the other narratives in the mid 20th century, if that makes sense.
It does. And one thing you said, I'll just say quickly, that popped into my mind is, you know, sporting and dandyism. I don't know if anybody's out there. I hope somebody's working on that, if you know, because I think there's a real like contemporary in a contemporary way. And I only know this because it's only recently I've paid any attention to football whatsoever because my partner likes it. But apparently he was pointing out some great kit to me that was pink with paisleys on it. And they're out, and I'm like, wow, like that's, there's seriously like some wild, really colorful, really, you know, not typically gendered football kit going on. But for collecting that, I think that would be really interesting. Actually, I'm not sure if it's, I think they were.
I think there's a lot. So one of the things that when I started looking at this, I've basically done a mini crash course in the history of like gender studies. So I'm definitely not up to speed on this, but I feel like what's been happening is we have gender studies running in parallel to the dress histories. And what was interesting for me was that a lot of gender historians were quoting people who were publishing around the same time that Chris Brewer's did his, you know, hidden consumers, but nobody was quoting him, and yet his book was saying exactly what the questions were asking.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Everyone should go read Chris if you haven't. Mackenzie did do a part 2 asking about gender fluid, if she thought gender fluidity had a lot to do with reclaiming sartorial elegance, which I love the way that whole statement is phrased, but you did talk about that actually a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I know Emily Gallagher's also made a comment about it being fascinating, but yeah, I think there's a lot of room to kind of think more about. It is really interesting.
Yeah, and I think the way that, so kind of going back to the gender fluidity, the way that we see ourselves today is going to really impact on the way that we interpret collections, which means that we are now able to go back and bring out stories that people didn't necessarily want to put into those objects, which is sort of what I was trying to highlight really swiftly with those few examples, is that those examples have come via women who have kept the family clothing because they've identified with this narrative of females getting into textiles and learning about textiles and the domestic narratives. But because of that, we have these stories, these alternative histories of men that the men themselves didn't see as worth collecting at the time. They wouldn't have done that. And I think now, because we've all got a much broader idea about identity narratives, we're able to kind of unpick this a little bit. Yeah, lots of, I guess it's that phrase that everyone uses, unpacking. Lots of unpacking got to be done.
Literally and philosophically.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think Veronica, what do you think?
Yeah, I will build on that, and this idea that what has been really lovely is a theme that's coming through today is this idea of re-looking at collections, re-looking at histories, and opening up the narrative. And I think and hope this feeds quite nicely into our final paper and our final speaker's work today, which is we're going to hear from Kimberly Lamb. And Kimberly is an associate professor of gender, sexuality, and feminist studies at Duke University, where she teaches courses on feminist art, literature, and visual culture. And she's also a research associate at VIAD, which stands for Visual Identities in Art and Design, with the University of Johannesburg. She's also written publications, including she's the author of Addressing the Other Woman, Textual Correspondences in Feminist Art and Writing, 2018, which explores the literary dimensions of feminist art practices from the late 1960s and 1970s. And alongside all of this, she's currently a fellow at Cornell University's Society for the Humanities and is working on a project that examines representations of fashionable clothing in Black women's writing from the late 19th century to the middle of the 20th century. And her paper today is called Behind the Scenes, Elizabeth Keckley's Written Garments and the Fabrication of Black Interiority. So I will now hand over to you, Kimberly.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much, Veronica. I really appreciate it. I'm really grateful to be able to present this very preliminary work. And I should say I'm not trained as a dress historian, but I've been participating in these seminars and learned a lot. And so I'm very thankful to be included, and thanks to Veronica and Robin for making things so comfortable and kind. So let me share my screen. Can you see that?
We can, yeah, it's just come up. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So I'd like to begin this paper devoted to the work of Elizabeth Keckley by drawing from Noeli Rooks's study, Ladies' Pages, African-American Women's Magazines and the Culture That Made Them. Rooks asks, is it possible to see silence? Can an unspoken history of violence and brutality find a language in the swish of a skirt gently caressing an ankle? This question highlights the psychic dimension of clothing and suggests that sartorial display can be considered a language that speaks to the psychic legacies of slavery's violence. Rook's lyrical formulation also suggests that clothing is a material practice that contains dimensions of subjectivity that were impacted by that violence but silenced. Those effects have to be read, she suggests, in the sensuous dimensions of wearing clothing, feeling it on the skin, and responding to its touch. Such responses are hard to generalize about and underscore that the experience of wearing clothing can be as unique and unpredictable as the person who wears it. My interest here is tracking how clothing figures into imagining spaces that sustain psychic singularity, or what a few scholars, Elizabeth Alexander, Kevin Quashie, and Christopher Freeberg, identify as the Black interior, a space that defies the assumption that Black women's subjective relationships to the history of slavery could be seen through or easily understood. While clothing is primarily a visual medium and a material practice, I'm working from the premise that literary texts are important for understanding the role clothing has played in the project of creating and sustaining the Black interior. By displacing the visual referent and rendering the tactile and sensuous dimensions of clothing, literature can evoke the subjective experience of wearing clothing from the inside out. It would be hard to claim that behind the scenes, my focus today, portrays Keckley's subjective experience of wearing clothing. Its focus is on making clothes for others, which I'll talk about, but it does lay crucial ground, I think, for Black women writers such as Jessie Fawcett, Nella Larson, Zora Neale Hurston, Ann Petrie, and Gwendolyn Brooks, the other writers that I'm examining. It lays the ground, I think, for them to write about the pleasures and sensations of wearing clothing, and allows them to represent how Black women have, through clothing, claimed spaces of subjective interiority for themselves. Behind the Scene marks a transition from women's work with clothing during slavery to the skilled economy of dressmaking during Reconstruction. In it, Keckley narrates her life in enslavement, her acquisition of freedom with money she earned as a dressmaker, and then her work as a modiste for Mary Todd Lincoln during the first term of the Lincoln presidency and 42 days into his second term. There are portrait photographs of Keckley that I don't know too much about yet. The first two are from the 1860s, so maybe perhaps the pinnacle of her career and the beginning of her work at the White House. And the third is from her, the latter part of her life when she was running a Department of Sewing and Domestic Sciences at Wilberforce University in Ohio, the first HBCU in the United States. One of the things I do know about these images is that due to Keckley's fame as a dressmaker, they highlight the intimate connections between portrait photography and clothing, the latter of which is for the most part skipped over in the scholarship on US photography and the role has played in the assertion of Black visibility. This omission is part of the larger erasure of Black women's labor, both in US history at large, but also in a text such as W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America, 1860 to 1880, which was published in 1935. As Sadia Hartman points out, Du Bois's Black Reconstruction reaffirms the naturalized alignment of men with the category of the worker. So the domestic work Black women were made to perform, particularly with fabric and clothing, laundering, sewing, and mending, are outside its picture of history. Documenting how her work with clothing as an enslaved woman led to her prestigious position as the modiste for the First Lady of the United States, Behind the Scenes is a memoir that can be read in relationship to the lives of many Black women who worked with clothing behind the scenes, whether as laundresses, seamstresses, dressmakers, or modistes, but whose life stories are not recorded or easy to find in the historical archives. Behind the Scenes is also, as many scholars of 19th century literature have noticed, noted, a challenging text to identify generically and politically. Published in 1868, Behind the Scenes is not an abolitionist narrative. It is instead what William Andrews calls a post-Civil War ex-slave autobiography that fits uncomfortably within what he describes as the confines of the antebellum slave narrative tradition, which is the dominant image that we hold of the genre. Unlike a text such as Linda Brent's Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, published in 1861, Keckley's narrative is not wholly devoted to exposing slavery's horrors and degradations. As Jennifer Fleshner explains, Behind the Scenes reveals Keckley to be, quote, writing from within and writing about the tangled relations of slavery and freedom. While Behind the Scenes does not, as Andrew put it, soft pedal the injustices of slavery, Keckley's focus is on triumphing over it with hard work, ingenuity, and determination. It has been described as a text of uplift with affinities to Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery. Keckley stated that she wrote Behind the Scenes to legitimate the perspective of reputation and perspective of Mary Todd Lincoln in response to what is known as the Old Clothes Scandal, Lincoln's attempt to sell off her wardrobe in a private auction after the assassination of her husband, for which she was publicly excoriated. I think it is also safe to speculate that since Keckley's skills, talent, and expertise contributed substantially to Lincoln's collection of dresses, the narrative is also a way for Keckley to claim her labor and assert her value. In Closer to Freedom, Enslaved Women and Everyday Resistance in the Plantation South, historian Stephanie Camp demonstrates that making and wearing clothing allowed enslaved women to recalibrate the value to which slavery assigned them. As Camp explains, quote, women's style allowed them to take pleasure in their bodies, to deny that they were only or mainly worth the prices their owners placed on them. Behind the Scenes carefully continues those recalibrations. Of course, the fact that so much of Behind the Scenes is devoted to Lincoln's story and clothing, this makes it hard to see that Keckley's text is also about Black women's claim to their value. But as Janet Neary argues in her 2016 study, Fugitive Testimony, Behind the Scenes upends the expectation that the slave narrative will produce a familiar image of the suffering Black body, and instead places Keckley in the interior spaces of the White House and at the center of a prominent story. And I'm arguing that the figurative relation between clothing and writing is part of that intervention. The connection that Keckley draws between writing and sewing is actually not made explicit until the last paragraph of the narrative. After trying to help Lincoln sell her wardrobe, Keckley's dressmaking business was never recovered, and she concludes her text by writing from a rooming house in Brooklyn with the cheery perseverance she has been displaying throughout her text, as well as her propensity to, as Fleischner puts it, deflect anger away from white figures of authority. As Keckley writes, I have experienced many ups and downs, but I'm still stout of heart. The labor of a lifetime has brought me nothing in a pecuniary way. I have worked hard, but fortune, fickle dame, has not smiled upon me. If poverty did not weigh me down as it does, I would not now be toiling by day with my needle and writing by night in the plain little room on the 4th floor of number 14 Carroll Place. And yet I've learned to love the garret-like room. In memory, I have traveled through the shadows and the sunshine of the past, and the bare walls are associated with the visions that have come to me from long ago. By situating herself in this narrow space in which she lives, and the garret may be an allusion to incidents in the life of the slave girl, much of which takes place in a garret space, and linking this space to memory, Keckley crafts an image of her interiority, the space of subjectivity she claims and inhabits. And by making sewing and writing extensions of each other, Keckley encourages readers to think back through the narrative and remember her consistent attention to the work of sewing and the rushed rhythms of working under duress within slavery, but also at the White House. So this is my last page. In chapter 5, my introduction to Mrs. Lincoln, Keckley gives readers a glimpse of the temporal and emotional demands Lincoln placed upon her. She writes of taking the last stitches on a dress and carrying it to the White House, only to find Lincoln in a terrible state of excitement, distraught that the dress has arrived so close to the time she needed to depart for the ceremony, and refusing to allow Keckley to dress her. She relents, and her husband states, "You look charming in that dress. Mrs. Keckley has met with great success." From this declaration from the President of the United States, Keckley composes a portrayal of the First Lady in the dress she made, which is rich with descriptions of colors and fabric. Mrs. Lincoln looked elegant in her rose-colored moire antique. She wore a pearl necklace, pearl earrings, pearl bracelets, and red roses in her hair. Mrs. Baker was dressed in a lemon-colored dress, Mrs. Kellogg in a drab silk, ashes of rose, Mrs. Edwards in a brown and black silk, Miss Edwards in crimson, and Mrs. Grimsley in blue watered silk. I was surprised at her grace and composure. Mrs. Lincoln. I had heard so much in current and malicious report of her low life, of her ignorance and vulgarity, that I expected to see her embarrassed on this occasion. Report I soon saw was wrong. No queen, accustomed to the uses of royalty all her life, could have comported herself with more calmness and dignity than did the wife of the president. She was confident and self-possessed, and confidence always gives grace. Explicitly, this passage describes the stature and grace of Lincoln, but it also portrays how Keckley's work contributed to this image and thereby documents her keen sense of how to craft an image of white femininity through sartorial display. Rendered in words, this is a carefully tailored presentation of Keckley as a skilled and knowledgeable dressmaker, which defies the ignorance and vulgarity attributed to Black women during Reconstruction, and implicitly can be understood as unhinging femininity from the bodies of white women. Writing this scene allows, I'm speculating, Keckley to covertly participate in the visibility that the recognizable codes of gender promised Black women in the 19th century, but were so challenging for them to claim and possess. Mary Todd, and this is an image from Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, and I just thought it corresponded to Keckley's listing of the dresses and the materials, and a kind of like layering of the text that portrays these images of the dresses. Mary Todd Lincoln's decision to sell her dresses is one reason why there are so few designs that we know of that are Keckley's. These dresses showcase her talent for bold American style, what fashion scholar Elizabeth Way identifies as her clean lines and unpretentious designs. But passages such as the one I just cited above from Behind the Scenes inscribes her work with the value and meaning that Keckley brought to it. Thank you. I appreciate your attention.
Thank you. That was a really interesting paper. I learned so much from it. I know we've got a few questions coming in, I think, Robin, so I will hand over to you.
So Emily has kicked us off. Emily Taylor says, I'm interested in the ideas of hard work and uplift. This is something often imposed on less privileged classes by the middle classes in the UK. What do you think are the most useful ways to describe the difference between Black resistance and self-uplift versus white class-based self-dependency? That's a rich question.
Could you repeat the last part? It's
sure. Yeah, it's also
thing.
in the chat if you wanted to glance. She says, what do you think are the most useful ways to describe the difference between Black resistance and self-uplift versus white class-based self-dependency? And Emily,
that's a great question.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. And thanks, Robin, for rereading it. It's
of course.
it's sort of hard to move between.
No, it is. No worries. No worries.
I think that's a great question. I appreciate it. I think they're definitely related. I guess my inclination is to think of it in relationship to loss, and also, I mean, I think Uplift is, and Keckley's narrative is doing this, and Booker T. Washington's is doing that, is doing this, is drawing on white working class sensibilities and writing themselves into those narratives, and drawing on them, and claiming them for themselves, with it, while also showing the impediments, of course, that that skin color and racism have placed in the way of accessing those working class narratives. So that isn't a great response. I don't feel like that's a great response, but that's how I would begin to think about it, at least.
Thanks. Other questions, please go ahead and put in the chat. I'm vaguely familiar with Keckley only in my own sort of like, I should pay more attention to this subject and going to look for people, of color who have, or in fashion history, because there's such a massive gap. And there's so many great projects that have launched recently about it too. But could you talk a little bit more about her later career in Ohio? Like that's not something you expect, and I think is really important. And I'm just blanking on the university.
Wilberforce University.
Wilberforce, of course it is.
Wilberforce
Yes.
University.
Yeah.
I don't know tons about this. I would like to go to Wilberforce. I've tried to contact people there. Part of her connection to Wilberforce has to do with her son going there, and her son was in the military, and so. And it seems like it was sort of this teaching position was a bit of a refuge at the end of her, near the end of her life. And she took it up, I think, when she was 70, because her dressmaking career never really recovered from the post-assassination, post-old world scandal, old clothes scandal, never recovered from those events. So that's about as much as I know, but I want to go there, look at the archives, learn more about what she was teaching. I guess linking back to the previous question, I think it points to the importance of industrial education, which Booker T. Washington was promoting, and this huge history of industrial education, domestic education, sewing, that's kind of really been lost. Like, we don't really think of these homemaking departments or domestic economy departments as being part of universities or education, but it's a really big part of Keckley's story, and that there's a few places in the narrative where she describes teaching. She taught women in Washington, D.C. She taught women in St. Louis, and so the demonstration of skill is part of claiming a working class narrative, and really demonstrating that that skin color, it absolutely does not have anything to do with the acquisition of skills.
Yeah, and it is obviously a bigger, the relationship with gender. I mean, there's a lot of here in the UK, of course, there's loads is probably overdoing it, but in the field there is loads of discussion about women in teaching, and I do work on Glasgow School of Art and the whole needlework development scheme, and so it was a whole, there's loads of that, but I don't know as much about surely there are corollaries in America. I think vaguely, but where I think this is a really fascinating and under-researched area. And I also just wanted to say quickly too, You did start off with the whole, I'm not a dress historian, but we're so glad you're here for
Thank
that. Like this is really important that that's one of the goals of this group, to expand it, but also quite curious to know when people are coming from other disciplines and, what is it that we can offer as well, or what is it that people are looking for? So that doesn't matter at all. You're working on dress history, and that's really great.
Yeah, I should say I love learning part of my interest in the literature is learning about the language of clothes and trying to, find ways to describe things. And I think that literature kind of gives us tools for doing that. And I think what inspired me to get into this is I would look at dresses and not have the language to describe it. So that's something that I'm learning. And that seems like a part of the literary imagination.
Well, a lot of us who are apparently dress historians also learn that and don't make things, or make things very poorly. So we're all on a similar, you're not that far away from some of our journeys, and we all learn from each other in that regard. Veronica has asked if you've had the opportunity to examine any of the surviving garments at firsthand, which incidentally is one of those early hurdles for all of us who maybe aren't makers and stuff, is what am I even looking at and what am I looking for here? But she wondered about, or tracing patterns between the images and examples of her work and the way she described them in their writings. So have you had a chance to do any of that kind of stuff?
I haven't yet. I've tried to start. I've been looking through, Goody's Lady Book and different patterns and things, but I haven't had a chance to look at these objects. I want to do that, but I also want to do the hard work of looking at images from these periods, fashion plates, and putting them in dialogue with the images to kind of identify what I do see, at least in these dresses, which I should say have been made available through the Fashion History Timeline, which is such a great resource. I do see a very distinct style, a very distinct kind of streamlined modernist style, and so it would be great to put her work in dialogue with kind of dominant images and see how she's drawing from the patterns of a period, and thinking about that in relationship to the generic questions, the literary questions that I brought up at the beginning of the paper.
Sounds
great.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Really fascinating. I'm gonna jump in there, I think, because we've come to sort of a natural pause and start to draw things to a close. While I'm talking and whilst I remember, I will try and share our closing slide. If I can share the right one. Let's see if this works. This is the one I should be sharing. Okay. Firstly, I need to thank the speakers for a really fascinating series of papers that just happened to speak. It was sheer luck, partly, and also skill on our part, programming, that they spoke so well to one another. And just what is really nice about each event is that we are continually re-looking at different areas in dress history. And I love the fact that we're having people coming in saying that they're not dress historians, because I don't think anyone who would maybe even begin to identify themselves as a dress historian quite knows what a dress historian is, because it's so much about interdisciplinarity. There isn't a real boundary and where you draw information from in dress history. So we're really keen to facilitate interdisciplinary work, as Robin was saying. I need to, thank you, speakers. Thank you also to Robin for your excellent work question mastering, and to Hilary, who has been valiantly tweeting today, having just moved house. So I really appreciate that, Hilary, and also to Anna for being on backup duty in case anything went wrong. This slide that I'm sharing now is just to remind you of how you can keep in touch with us or get in touch with us. We've added a YouTube account to our portfolio now. We've only got 2 recordings up so far, but we are working on the rest. And we really hope that's going to provide a really useful resource for people going forward. We also want to issue our usual invitation to anyone attending today or at a future date to ask if you can share your research with us, because we're always keen to hear from you, and we hope this is a supportive space in which to share, established research that you did ages ago, something you're just starting on, or even to just come and do a 5-minute request to sort of get support with the research project you have in mind. It doesn't have to be a formal paper. And finally, I will end with a sort of mini trailer for next month's At Home, which will take place on Sunday, the 30th of May. And May's event is slightly different from what we've had before because it's featuring speakers from the Southern Hemisphere, I can't even say that. And this Antipedian, I'm not even getting these words out here, but this event will take place at a different time, which is why I wanted to trail it. It's taking place on a Sunday morning for us in the UK, 10 a.m. British summertime, 7 p.m. Eastern Australian time, 9 p.m. New Zealand time, and unfortunately for those joining us from the East Coast USA, 5 a.m., but you can still get up if you're really keen. And the reason we're doing this rather than our usual afternoon slot is that we really want to make this a space where researchers from across the globe can have the opportunity to share a paper at a time that isn't a horrendous time for them. And we hope it also allows you as attendees to gain access to researchers across the globe as well. So some of the speakers joining us will be Catriona Fisk, paper TBC, same for all of them, Fiona Riley, and Angela Lassig. And more details will follow very soon. We're just confirming paper titles with them. So basically watch this space, but just a date for your diaries is the 30th of May at 10 a.m. British summer time for our Southern Hemisphere based discussion. We hope the first of many. Thank you everyone for joining today and enjoy the rest of your Sundays, however much of them are left. And thank you finally to our speakers for one final time.